The auction room of Thornsby Hall was a place designed to impress rather more than to comfort. Its oak panelling glowed richly under lights that had been polished to a merciless brightness, and its rows of chairs, hastily borrowed from the parish hall, groaned under the weight of every gossip-hungry inhabitant within 10 miles. People had come to see bargains struck, heirlooms dispersed, and perhaps, though none would admit it, to measure what was left of a once proud family in terms of the contents of their cupboards. The auctioneer, a man whose smile had been lacquered into permanence, raised his gavel over the podium as though he were about to bless the crowd with benediction, rather than unleash the first of many disputes about provenance and price. "Lot number 1, he intoned. "A Regency sideboard, mahogany, with brass inlay. Shall we begin at £20? The hall buzzed, and hands twitched in laps like the wings of restless birds. It was the atmosphere of anticipation that mattered most, an entire town on tiptoe, waiting for the drama of possessions changing hands. But what none of them expected was that the drama would not come from the furniture. It began with a cry from the back. A woman's voice, sharp and oddly triumphant, rang out above the auctioneer's drone. "That's not mahogany, it's stolen!" Heads turned with the well-rehearsed snap of villagers who knew the precise speed required to avoid missing any morsel of scandal. And there she was, Mrs. Eleanor Preece, the postmistress, standing with both arms akimbo like a tragic heroine in a church play. Her eyes, round and feverish, were fixed not on the sideboard, but on the man 2 rows ahead of her. "Mr. Tudge," she declared, "ought to tell you all where that came from." The room froze. Then it broke into ripples of murmurs, astonished whispers, and 1 or 2 gleeful snorts. Poor Mr. Tudge, a thick-set fellow whose usual excitements extended no further than the upkeep of his allotment, turned a shade of puce and made a strangled protest. The auctioneer, flustered but unwilling to forfeit his authority, struck his gavel with unnecessary ferocity. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, decorum. This is an auction, not a courtroom." It was precisely the kind of outburst the audience had secretly hoped for, and the air thickened with relish. Someone had thrown a stone into the still pond of civic respectability, and now every ripple would be savoured. "Mark my words," muttered Mrs. Bracewell, who had shifted her bulk to the aisle seat for better gossip-collecting efficiency. "That sideboard was in his shop window only last month, then gone overnight, and now here it is." From the opposite side of the hall, the vicar's wife leaned to her neighbour and whispered, "I heard she's only saying it because he refused to let her cut the front of the Christmas parcel queue." A man in a cap, smelling faintly of beer, whispered loudly enough for 3 rows to hear, "Tudge has been up to something for years. Remember the silver spoons? Vanished, they did." A young council clerk, no more than 25 and eager for importance, interjected with a certain stiffness, "It's nothing to do with us. The police ought to settle it, if there's anything to it at all." Meanwhile, from the back row, a half-heard mutter floated forward, thin as smoke. "Not the sideboard you need to be asking about. It's the clock. Always the clock." Inspector Purbright, seated without ceremony along the side wall, had not moved during any of this. He was present partly out of civic duty. Sales of deceased estates had a way of breeding quarrels, and partly because he had found that places where money and memory collided were often the most revealing about human behavior. His companion, Sergeant Love, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Should we do something, sir?" Love whispered. Purbright adjusted his spectacles and let his gaze travel to the stage. What he noticed was not Mrs. Preece's crimson outrage or Mr. Tudge's sweaty embarrassment, but the sideboard itself. Its lower drawer gaped open just half an inch, as though someone had been careless or too deliberate in closing it. Inside, glinting faintly, was a folded scrap of paper. Most would have missed it. Purbright did not. "Not yet, love," he said softly. "The room is still speaking." The auctioneer attempted to reclaim control, hammering his gavel and insisting upon the continuation of proceedings. Reluctantly, the crowd's attention returned to the ritual of bidding, though the air still quivered with suppressed conjecture. Purbright, unobtrusive as a shadow, made a note in his small leather-bound book. One item had already sold itself, and it was not the sideboard. At the interval, when villagers surged toward tea-urns and ginger biscuits, Purbright lingered near the disputed piece of furniture. He bent, seemingly to inspect the polish, but in truth to note the faint smudge across the brass handle of the drawer. Not dust, it had been wiped recently, and not by the auctioneer's staff, whose carelessness was notorious. Someone had interfered with it only this morning. He straightened slowly, expression unreadable. Love joined him, balancing a paper cup of tea. "Do you believe Mrs. Priest's accusation?" Love asked. Purbright allowed himself a small smile. "Belief is for the church, Sergeant. Here, one notices." "What have you noticed, then?" "That the woman's fury was directed more at the man than at the furniture." Love blinked. "So you think it's personal?" Purbright's smile deepened a fraction. "In Flaxborough, Sergeant, everything is personal." The gavel had only just resumed its dance when the second disruption came. A man burst into the hall, face pale and coat askew, stumbling over the knees of the front row in his haste. He leaned close to the auctioneer and whispered, something that made the lacquered smile vanish instantly. The auctioneer cleared his throat, hands trembling on the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he stammered, we must suspend the sale. There has been, a most unfortunate matter." Gasps rose. Chairs scraped. The hall hummed like a hive poked with a stick. Purbright's eyes did not leave the stage. His fingers closed his notebook with a quiet snap, because the auctioneer, in his dismay, had let slip 3 words before he realized it. "The clock's missing." And in that moment, every assumption made in the room shifted. The announcement of the missing clock struck the auction room with the strange hush that follows a dropped hymn book during a solemn service. Not silence exactly, but an indrawn breath, collective and involuntary. Then came the rustle of movement, the whispers surging back like a tide. Those closest to the auctioneer leaned forward. Those at the back craned their necks. The auctioneer himself looked as though he'd swallowed his gavel. Inspector Purbright remained exactly where he was, his hands neatly folded behind his back. Sergeant Love, however, was already halfway to the stage, shouldering his way through the curious with a mild but insistent politeness that made him curiously effective in crowds. The man who had brought the news, a junior solicitor by the name of Denzil Cheetham, was wringing his hands and blinking furiously behind thick lenses. "It's gone," he kept repeating. "The bar-wise regulator, Mr. Copeland's long case clock. Lot 42. It's simply vanished." Purbright approached slowly, speaking with a gentle authority that made people part for him like water. "Mr. Cheetham," he said, "may I assume you had some reason to look for the clock now, rather than during its lot time?" Cheetham bobbed his head. Yes, of course. You see, Mr. Copeland's niece, Miss Honoria, she requested it be withdrawn from the sale. A matter of family sentiment, apparently. She came to me not 20 minutes ago." "And was the clock already on display?" Purbright's voice was mild, but his eyes were steady on the young man's. "In the anteroom, yes, along with several other larger items. It had been checked and tagged by the auction staff this morning. I saw it myself at 10:15. "And now?" Purbright asked, though he already suspected the answer. Cheetham shook his head miserably. "Gone. Not moved, not misplaced. The pedestal rug is still there, even the chalk outline where the staff marked the base. But the bar-wise itself is simply no longer present." Love arrived at Purbright's side, a hint of color high in his cheeks. "I've had a word with Mr. Omble, the porter. He swears blind the room was locked until just before the viewing opened. Says he unlocked it himself at 10 to 11. Purbright nodded once. "And when was it last seen?" A woman from the History Society said she admired it around 20 past. She was quite definite. That gives us, Purbright checked the dial of his watch, a window of less than 30 minutes. The inspector's gaze returned to the auctioneer, who stood near the podium as though guarding the remaining lots from theft by telepathy. "Would you be so kind as to pause the sale for a few more minutes?" Purbright asked. "A theft under your roof is unfortunate. A second, without investigation, would be considered negligent." The auctioneer swallowed and nodded hastily. Of course, Inspector. Anything you need." Purbright turned on his heel and headed for the anteroom. Love trailed behind, glancing now and then at the murmuring crowd that watched their retreat with unabashed interest. The anteroom was small, windowless, and pungent with a blend of polish and old dust. It housed an assortment of unsold items, 2 carved oak chairs, a copper warming pan, and a Victorian pram with one handle conspicuously missing. Against the far wall, beneath a fading portrait of Queen Mary, was the vacant square of rug where the bar-wise regulator had evidently stood. Love whistled low. You'd think someone might notice a grandfather clock being carried out. Not if it wasn't carried out, Purbright replied, kneeling by the space. Note the chalk markings, still crisp. No scuff marks, no drag trail, which means it wasn't slid or tilted. Then how? Purbright's brow furrowed as he straightened. Let's consider 2 possibilities. 1, the clock was removed before the public entered, which means one of the staff, or someone with staff access. Or 2, it was dismantled and taken out piece by piece during the auction. Love blinked. Is that possible? Taking apart a thing like that? Possible, Purbright said, though not quick, and certainly not quiet. The sergeant looked at the empty space as if hoping the clock might reappear under scrutiny. Suppose someone faked its presence earlier. Something that looked like a clock from a distance? Purbright looked amused. A cardboard silhouette, Sergeant? Love flushed. Well, you never know. True, and yet I find the simpler explanation more satisfying. He paced to the door and opened it. A woman stood just outside, hand poised to knock. She was tall and imperious, dressed in a charcoal suit that had certainly never seen mothballs, and carried a small handbag with the air of someone accustomed to its contents resolving minor emergencies. Her voice, when she spoke, was rich and cool as rain on slate. I am Honoria Copeland. I presume you are the inspector. Purbright inclined his head. Indeed, Miss Copeland, you've arrived with very precise timing. I do most things precisely, Inspector. She glanced toward the vacant patch of rug. So it is true. You were close to your uncle, I understand. I cared for him in his final months, yes, though we were not always close. He could be challenging. And yet the clock held value for you. She frowned. My uncle once told me it would never be sold, that it belonged to the family. He kept important papers hidden in the base. Purbright's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Papers? Documents. He was a solicitor inspector. There were always documents. Love scratched his head. Any idea what sort? Honoria's lips twitched. If I knew that, Sergeant, I might not have needed to request the withdrawal. Purbright studied her for a moment, then gestured to the room. Would you mind taking a look? Anything missing? Disturbed? She stepped inside, eyes scanning the surfaces. The chairs have been moved, and that pram was never here. But as for the clock, she shook her head, helpless now. Purbright thanked her and stepped out. He motioned to Love. Have someone check the side entrances and the alley behind the hall. You think they used the back? If they did, they would have needed a vehicle, and some luck. Or planning, Love added. Quite so. They were interrupted by a scuffle of footsteps. Mrs. Eleanor Preece approached, flanked by 2 friends like a moral phalanx. Her voice rose before she reached them. I'll tell you what this is, Inspector. It's retribution. Divine or otherwise. Retribution for what, Mrs. Preece? Purbright asked gently. "For selling what should never have been for sale. That clock was promised to the church. My cousin overheard the bequest. He told me so himself." Purbright's eyes sharpened. "That would be a legal bequest. In writing?" "Not yet, but my cousin says Mr. Copeland mentioned it more than once at the vestry." Love exchanged a glance with Purbright. "That's two people claiming ownership," he muttered. "Family and church." "Which," said Purbright softly, "makes the theft not just inconvenient, but advantageous." More answers in next section. But before that, who do you think wanted the clock gone first, the family or the faithful? The auction resumed with all the tension of a hymn sung out of tune, halting, uncertain, and interspersed with glances over shoulders. Though the clock's disappearance had been quietly framed as a regrettable inventory discrepancy, no one believed it. Not really. In a town like Flaxborough, even the whisper of theft was enough to make people see shadows where there were none and secrets in every silence. Inspector Purbright, now positioned unobtrusively by the refreshments table, sipped a tepid cup of tea and watched the crowd with the expression of a man attending a theatrical farce whose playwright he quietly suspected of murder. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, was engaged in quiet conversation with Mr. Omble, the porter, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as their discussion wore on. "There's something odd about the pram, sir," Love said as he returned, voice lowered. "Omble swears it wasn't there when he opened the anteroom this morning. Says it must have been wheeled in during the commotion." Purbright arched an eyebrow. Unusual item to smuggle into an auction unnoticed. "Unless," Love said, "it was used to smuggle something out." They both turned slowly toward the back of the hall, where the Victorian pram still sat by the exit, its hood drawn forward like a mourner at a wake. Love was already moving before Purbright could speak. It took the sergeant several moments to wheedle it open. He was careful, as if afraid the thing might spring to life and demand christening. But when he finally pulled back the cover and examined the inner lining, he let out a low whistle. "Well, there's no baby inside, but someone's been clever." The padding had been rearranged to create a false bottom. Tucked beneath it, faint traces of grease and wood dust clung to the fabric. Love stepped back, eyes wide. Something heavy and mechanical was in here not long ago, and the lining's torn. "Look here, sir. Brass filings." Purbright leaned in, running a finger gently along the edge. "Part of the clock's innards, perhaps. Removed, transported separately. So it was dismantled. Likely. Carried out in pieces. Daring, but effective." "Who brings a pram to an auction, anyway?" Love asked, scanning the crowd now with fresh suspicion. "Especially an empty one." Purbright didn't answer. He was watching the doorway, his eyes narrowing. Just then, a sudden burst of laughter rang from the auction floor. A tall woman in a cobalt blue coat was fanning herself dramatically and recounting, to no one in particular, the tale of a wedding where the bride had tripped over a candelabra. Her audience laughed, but Purbright didn't join in. He had seen her before, briefly, earlier that morning, hovering near the refreshments with a pram. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "make inquiries about that woman. Blue coat, tall. She brought the pram. Find out her name." Love nodded and disappeared into the crowd with practiced ease. Purbright, meanwhile, moved to the side of the room and pulled out his notebook. He had sketched a crude diagram, just a rough visual map of the auction hall, the anteroom, and its 2 points of access. One led to the lobby and street beyond. The other opened into a narrow corridor which connected with the back alley. Seldom used, often overlooked. If someone had wheeled the pram down that corridor, they could have reached the alley in under a minute. And from there, any number of possibilities. He turned a page in his notebook and wrote, with neat precision, "Clock hidden in a pram. False bottom. Removed between 11:20 and 11:50. Woman in blue, likely facilitator. Who benefits? Who risks? Love returned, slightly flushed from the effort of navigating so many converging conversations. Name's Mrs. Lavinia Prentice. She's from Fenley. Lane widow of Harold Prentice, the cabinet maker. Purbright looked up sharply. Cabinet maker? Yes, sir. She still runs the shop, though most say it's only part-time now. She would know how to disassemble something like the bar-wise clock. That's what I was thinking, Love said. And maybe even how to put it back together, out of sight. Purbright was silent for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook and adjusted his cuffs. Let's pay her a visit. Quietly. If she's involved, she'll either be celebrating her success or starting to panic. They waited until the next lot began. Some heavy bronze urn that no one looked particularly keen to bid on, and then slipped away from the hall, unnoticed except by one boy who sat chewing a toffee and watching them with a conspiratorial grin. Fenley Lane was only a 10-minute walk from the auction hall. It was the sort of street that looked like it had never once produced a scandal, and therefore was long overdue for one. The Prentice shop stood on the corner, its sign faded and slightly askew. Through the front window, Purbright could see various items of furniture in mid-restoration. Chairs without cushions, tables half-varnished, and a grandfather clock case, conspicuously empty. The bell above the door tinkled as they stepped in. A woman emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on a cloth. She was not wearing the cobalt blue coat now, but Purbright recognized her at once. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Prentice," he said mildly. She blinked. "Oh, goodness, I didn't expect company. Are you from the auction?" "I'm Inspector Purbright. This is Sergeant Love. We're following up on a matter concerning a missing clock." She hesitated only a fraction too long before replying. "Oh, I heard about that. Terrible. Though I'm sure it's just been misplaced." Purbright offered a gentle smile. "I'd like to believe that too, but things rarely undisappear on their own." He let his eyes drift meaningfully to the disassembled clock frame leaning against the back wall. "Was this being restored?" he asked, walking toward it without waiting for permission. Mrs. Prentice stepped forward, flustered. "That's not the bar-wise. That's something my late husband was working on. It's been here for months." Purbright crouched beside the clock, examining the edge of the wooden frame. A corner still bore a small rectangular patch where a label had recently been removed. The outline of the adhesive was fresh. "Curious," he murmured. Love, meanwhile, had taken interest in a nearby workbench. He held up a brass finial. "Still warm," he said. Mrs. Prentice crossed her arms. "Are you accusing me of something, Inspector?" "I'm asking questions," he replied. "You brought a pram to the auction today. You left without it." Her voice sharpened. "It was taken. Stolen. That pram belonged to my sister. I stepped out for a cigarette, and when I returned, it was gone." "You didn't report it?" "I was embarrassed. It was an old thing, a family relic. I didn't want anyone thinking I was careless." Purbright straightened slowly. "This town has a memory for relics, Mrs. Prentice, and a sharp eye for things that don't belong." He walked back toward the door and paused with one hand on the frame. "Suggest you take the rest of the day to consider your position. We'll be back shortly, with a warrant if necessary." He left, the sergeant following close behind. Outside, the air was crisp and damp with the promise of rain. Purbright did not speak until they reached the corner. "She's hiding something," Love said. "Certainly. But whether it's the clock or merely guilt by proximity remains to be seen." "You believe her?" "I believe she's scared, and fear has a way of making people careless." They turned toward the station, both men thoughtful. By the time Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love returned to the station, the sky had begun its slow descent into the grey heaviness that so often passed for twilight in Flaxborough. Rain had not yet begun, but it lingered just behind the clouds, waiting for the most inconvenient moment. The inspector removed his overcoat with a kind of ceremonial slowness and hung it neatly on the rack, while Love trailed after him, cheeks pink from the chill and his mind still full of Mrs. Prentice and the warm brass finial. They settled in the small incident room where the tea was lukewarm and the walls carried the scent of damp file paper. Purbright took his seat and let out a faint sigh, the kind that often preceded deductions or disappointment, depending on the case. "She knows more than she says," Love began, not bothering to sit. "If we gave her another hour alone in that shop, I'd wager she'd burn half the evidence and try to varnish the rest." "Possibly," said Purbright, "but fear and guilt wear similar coats. I'd rather not hang her for the fit until we're certain which she's wearing." Love frowned. "And what now?" "Wait until she makes a mistake." Purbright opened the notebook and thumbed back to the earlier pages. Number "We" pressed gently on another front. "The bequest, the church angle." "Precisely." He stood again, somewhat reluctantly, and gestured for Love to follow. "Fetch your coat, Sergeant. I believe it's time we heard the vicar's version." St. Ethelwald sat hunched between two Georgian terraces, like an old man who'd lost the thread of conversation and was now merely trying to appear alert. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and beeswax polish. A choir rehearsal was in progress. Small boys with angelic faces and hellish attention spans, one of whom dropped a hymnal with a reverberating crash as the detectives entered. The Reverend Edwin Plimpton was a small man with a wide smile and unfortunate posture. He greeted them with a handshake too warm for the season and led them into a vestry office that resembled a moderately disheveled second-hand bookshop. "I'm terribly sorry to hear about the theft," he said, offering them mismatched chairs. "Dreadful business. Not at all in the spirit of our little community." "You were aware," Purbright asked, "of the Copeland estate sale?" "Oh, yes. Miss Honoria came to see me only last week, most distressed about the whole affair. Said she was doing her best to preserve the more personal pieces." "And the clock?" Plimpton nodded gravely. "The bar-wise regulator, a beautiful timepiece. Mr. Copeland promised it to the church years ago. He said it was to hang in the parish hall after his death. A sort of legacy, I think." "Was this in writing?" Purbright asked. The vicar grimaced. "Number it" was said aloud more than once, but I'm afraid nothing was ever drawn up formally. Love leaned forward. "Do you believe he meant it?" "I believe he meant it at the time," Plimpton said carefully. "But Mr. Copeland had a habit of promising different things to different people depending on whom he'd spoken with last. It wouldn't surprise me if his niece believed it was hers, or someone else thought they had a claim too." Purbright glanced at a ledger sitting open on the desk beside them. "What is that?" he asked mildly. "The vestry list. Just notes on parish bequests and maintenance donors. That sort of thing." Purbright leaned closer. "May I?" Of course. The inspector skimmed the entries. It was a tangle of dates, surnames, modest amounts for flowers and candle wax. Then he paused. "Lot 42. BR. Promised for Chapel Hall display pending approval. 12th of March. He tapped the note lightly. "Would this be your shorthand for the bar-wise regulator?" Plimpton peered over. "Yes, I believe so. I try to be brief. I don't always succeed." "Approval from whom?" "The vestry committee. Items promised to the parish must be accepted formally. It's part of the diocesan guidelines, a sort of bureaucratic courtesy." "And was this item approved?" The motion was delayed. Mrs. Chudley, the organist, was uncertain whether the clock would fit the wall near the war memorial. Aesthetic reasons, you see. Love muttered. So the clock was promised, noted, but never confirmed. Purbright sat back. "It's curious, isn't it, that so many seem to want this clock, yet none can claim it outright." Plimpton hesitated. "There is one more thing. I'm not sure it matters." "Go on," said Purbright. "Mr. Copeland once said the clock contained something valuable. Not just monetary value. He hinted it had history. Papers, I assumed. Or perhaps letters. He was an odd man, secretive near the end." Purbright nodded slowly. "That fits with what his niece suggested." The vicar folded his hands on the table. "It's not unheard of, Inspector. Families who lived through 2 wars and 3 national scandals often kept their truth somewhere safer than a drawer. Did he ever mention who might want what was hidden?" Plimpton shook his head. "Only that it might be better received after his death." That was enough for Purbright. He thanked the vicar, declined tea with a soft apology, and left the church with a briskness that made Love quicken his stride to keep up. "Where now?" Love asked. "Back to the hall." "But why?" "Because," said Purbright, "if a clock was dismantled and taken out in a pram, someone had to know how to do it, and someone else had to know what was inside. I'd like to know who else wandered near the anteroom today." Back at Thornsby Hall, the auction was winding down. Only a few stragglers remained, casting regretful glances at unsold side tables and faded watercolors. Mr. Ambler was stacking chairs, his movements slow but methodical. Purbright approached him. "Mr. Ambler, earlier today, did you happen to notice anyone in the anteroom who seemed less interested in the furniture than in the clock?" The porter scratched his chin. "Hard to say. A lot of people came through, but now you mention it, there was one chap. Stood with his back to the clock, talking to someone on a mobile. Kept saying, 'Yes, it's still here. Yes,' just like he said. Looked a bit out of place." "Did you catch a name?" "Number, but I remember him leaving with a lady in a green hat. Had the look of a couple pretending not to be." Love scribbled a note. "Green hat? That's right. Floppy thing. Looked like something from the gardening club raffle." Purbright's eyes narrowed. "I think we'll be needing the guest list. If there was one, there was," said Ambler. "We had people sign in by the entrance for the viewing, just for head count. Fire code and all that." "Fetch it," said Purbright. "And quickly." Because now, at last, they had 2 new leads. A man who knew what to look for, and a woman who knew how to disappear into the crowd. The guest list arrived in a creased manila envelope that smelled faintly of pipe smoke and carpet deodorizer. Mr. Ambler had apologized profusely for its untidy state, claiming that it had been compiled in a rush and hadn't had its corners flattened yet. Inspector Purbright accepted it with a polite nod and no visible sign of judgment, though he did frown slightly as he removed the sheaf of loosely handwritten pages within. The entries were irregular. Some had signed with full names, others merely with initials, and at least one in a flamboyant swirl that could have read as either Lancelot Frimley or Florence Flambert. Purbright's eye moved steadily down the columns, lips tightening almost imperceptibly when he reached the halfway mark. "There," he said, tapping the page with the tip of a neatly trimmed fingernail. "Row 26. Reeve, Fenley. Followed by Companion V. Loring." Love leaned over his shoulder, reading aloud. "A. Reeve. That's a solicitor, isn't it? Senior partner at Reeve, Tilbury and Maynard," Purbright confirmed. "A rather selective practice, not the sort to attend auctions for fun." "And the companion?" "I've no idea. But green hats don't tend to travel alone." Love blinked. "You think she's the one?" "I think she's worth talking to." It took the better part of half an hour to confirm Reeve's business address. The receptionist at his firm was all starch and suspicion, but after a brief introduction and a flash of Purbright's identification, she admitted the man had signed out for personal matters just before 11 that morning. "That would place him at the hall," Love murmured as they walked back toward the station. "And in the time window when the clock vanished." "Precisely." Purbright instructed the desk sergeant to telephone Reeve's office with a request for an informal interview. He phrased it delicately, as was his style. "A few clarifications. Nothing urgent, but potentially helpful. Then he dispatched Love to inquire discreetly at the greengrocer's, where vivid hats and their wearers were often the subject of lively discussion. He returned just past 4, damp from the rising drizzle and carrying the scent of potatoes. "Got her," he said. "Veronica Loring lives alone in a cottage out toward Bellringer's Hollow. Bit of an eccentric, according to Mr. Haskin, always in hats. Once kept bees in her bedroom, for the acoustic effect," she said. Purbright raised a mild brow. "And connected to Reeve?" "Not directly, but she's often seen talking to him in the market. People say she collects historical oddities, locks of hair, old diaries, bits of ceremonial robes. She once bought an entire curate's wardrobe from the vicarage jumble sale. Then perhaps she isn't just a bystander." They arrived at Loring's cottage just as the rain began properly, a soft but determined fall that slicked the stones underfoot and misted the hedgerows like breath on glass. The cottage was low-roofed and tangled in ivy, with a kind of crooked chimney that suggested it had once hosted serious witchcraft or amateur jam-making. Love knocked. The door opened within moments, revealing a woman of indeterminate age, eyes sharp behind oversized spectacles and a cardigan the color of old mustard. "I was expecting you," she said. Purbright smiled gently. "You were?" She stepped back. "Well, someone. You can't walk into a room with that kind of tension and not draw attention. Besides, the auctioneer practically turned blue." They followed her into a sitting room that appeared to be part museum, part aviary, and part unlicensed spiritual retreat. Books were stacked in impossible towers, candles half melted into teacups, and a large cage. In the corner housed a parrot who regarded them with baleful intelligence. "You were at Thornsby Hall today," Purbright began. "I was," she said, "sitting on the edge of a pouf. And yes, I was with Mr. Reeve, though only temporarily. What drew your interest to the auction?" "The clock, naturally." She glanced at them both, daring contradiction. Purbright accepted the bait. "Because of its value?" "Because of its contents." "Which you were aware of?" "Not specifically. But I've seen enough family sales to know when an item carries emotional dust. The way Miss Copeland hovered near it. The way Tudge flinched when anyone asked about Lot 42. And that woman, Mrs. Preece, hovering like a bloodhound with indigestion." Love scribbled furiously while Purbright kept his eyes on Loring. "Did you see anyone approach the clock before it vanished?" She hesitated, pursing her lips. "I saw someone come out of the anteroom with a limp, a slow, calculated limp. He was pushing something. Not a pram, exactly. More like a trolley with cloth draped over it. But the way he moved, deliberate. As if he knew exactly how much attention he didn't want." "Did you recognize him?" "Number, but he wore gloves and a long coat. I thought at first it was a delivery man." Purbright made a note. "Anything else?" "He dropped something. I picked it up, actually." She reached into the folds of her cardigan and produced a small object wrapped in a tissue. It looked out of place. Not part of any lot. Not something one drops without concern. Purbright unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a narrow brass escutcheon plate, curved to fit the base of a long case clock. He glanced at Love. "Proof. Proof someone was removing it in parts," Love said. Loring sipped tea from a chipped mug. "You won't find the rest. Not unless you know what the papers inside were worth." Purbright looked at her. "Do you?" "Only this," she said. "If the clock went missing, it wasn't for its chimes." Back at the station, a message awaited them. Mr. Reeve would meet them tomorrow morning at 10 in his office. Purbright set the brass plate gently on his desk, eyes narrowed in thought. Then he said, to no one in particular, "We've been looking at who took the clock. But perhaps it's time to ask, who planted the idea that it should vanish?" The following morning arrived with a rare burst of sunshine, but the cheer in the sky did little to ease the mounting tension as Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love approached the tall sandstone offices of Reeve, Tilbury, and Maynard. The firm's polished brass plate reflected the sunlight in a way that suggested success and caution in equal measure. It was the kind of establishment where even the dust was discreet. Inside, they were met by the same receptionist as before, who now seemed a touch less frosty, having clearly been advised that the police were not to be treated like magazine salesmen. She ushered them into a small, immaculate meeting room with a bay window and a table so glossy it nearly reflected the rafters. Moments later, Aubrey Reeve entered, tall, gaunt, immaculately tailored, and giving off the faint smell of good cologne and careful omissions. "Inspector Purbright," he said smoothly. "And Sergeant. Love, is it? A pleasure." Purbright rose with a nod, his handshake firm but brief. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us." "Of course. Always glad to assist the constabulary. You're inquiring, I believe, about the regrettable incident at the auction." "Yes," Purbright said. "You were present, were you not?" "I was. Briefly. I viewed some lots in the morning and left before lunch break. I had other appointments." "And Miss Loring accompanied you?" "She did," Reeve said with a flicker of discomfort. "A friend of many years. We sometimes attend local sales together. She has an eye for curiosities." Love leaned forward. "Did you view the bar-wise regulator?" Reeve smiled politely. "It was hard to miss. Magnificent piece. I noted it but made no inquiries. Frankly, I suspected it would draw too much attention for my tastes." "You weren't aware that it had been withdrawn from sale?" Purbright asked. Reeve paused, just long enough. "No, I wasn't. But that's not unusual in these cases. Items are often pulled at the last moment for sentimental reasons." "You had no interest in acquiring it?" Love pressed. "I assure you, Sergeant, I have no shortage of clocks." The inspector's gaze moved slowly around the room. Legal certificates lined the walls in tight black frames. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its pendulum ticking steadily, though its case was distinctly more modern than the missing bar-wise. "Did you notice anyone behaving oddly that morning?" Purbright asked. "Anyone loitering near the anteroom, making calls, moving equipment?" Reeve folded his hands. "There was the usual jostle, of course. One fellow nearly stepped on my foot while backing away from a sideboard. But I can't say anyone stood out. To be candid, I wasn't paying much attention to the crowd." "You left before the clock vanished," Purbright said softly. "So I understand," Reeve replied, "though I confess I'm surprised at the fuss. Surely the piece will turn up. An accident, perhaps. A misfiled inventory." Purbright reached into his satchel and withdrew the brass escutcheon recovered from Miss Loring. "Recognize this?" Reeve regarded it coolly. "Part of a clock case, I presume?" "It was found outside the auction hall under a bench. It likely came from the bar-wise. Suggests it was being dismantled. In haste." Reeve's expression did not change. "Then your thief was clumsy and desperate. Not the sort to enlist a solicitor and an eccentric collector as accomplices, I hope?" "No," said Purbright, "but perhaps the sort who benefited from being overlooked while someone else drew attention." There was a pause, measured and brittle. Reeve adjusted his cufflinks. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Inspector, but if there's any formal request you'd like to make, you know where to reach me." Purbright stood. "Thank you. I'm sure we'll speak again." Back on the pavement, Love exhaled noisily. "He's hiding something. You could hear it in his teeth." "Indeed," Purbright said. "Though what he's hiding may not be guilt. It may be knowledge." They had just begun walking when the call came through. The constable at the station reported that Miss Honoria Copeland had arrived unannounced and in a state of agitation. When they returned, they found her pacing the incident room like a cat trapped in a haberdashery. She was dressed, as always, with careful control. everything grey except for the violently red brooch pinned to her lapel. "I've received a letter," she announced, producing an envelope from her handbag and waving it like a distress flag. "And I believe it pertains to the clock." Purbright motioned for her to sit and took the envelope with care. It was unmarked except for her name, written in neat, old-fashioned script. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. He opened it and read silently. "Miss Copeland, you will not find the Barwise again. It is in safe hands, and its contents are no longer your concern. Certain truths are better left buried. Let sleeping clocks lie." There was no signature. Love swore under his breath. "Did it arrive by post?" Purbright asked. "Delivered by hand. Slipped through the letterbox this morning. No return address. No witnesses." He turned the envelope over. The paper was thin but of good quality. A faint watermark. Fendrick's Linen Bond. An expensive brand sold only in 2 shops locally. One of them, Purbright recalled, was adjacent to the solicitor's office. He turned to Honoria. "Have you spoken to anyone else about the possibility of papers being hidden in the clock?" She shook her head. "Only you. Then someone's listening very closely." She looked up, her features drawn. "Inspector, I don't care about the clock itself, but if my uncle's past is being dragged up, I need to know what's in those papers. He was involved in something during the war. Something questionable." Purbright sat back. "Espionage. Number property. Transactions. Land taken, sold, then reclaimed. I've seen letters. Suggestions that certain assets were never declared. And now, with the estate being picked apart," she trailed off. The inspector steepled his fingers. If those documents were inside the Barwise, and someone feared their contents, then this wasn't theft, it was preemptive silencing. "Do you think they'll destroy them?" "No," Purbright said. "I think they'll read them first, then decide." Love cleared his throat. "So we're not just after a thief now?" "No," Purbright said. "We're after someone who's rewriting history." Inspector Purbright did not return immediately to the auction hall, nor to the solicitor's office. Instead, he asked Sergeant Love to retrieve a sealed envelope from the station's evidence drawer, then turned his attention to the archives housed at the rear of the Flaxborough Library. A low, grey-bricked extension that smelled faintly of damp and cataloguing ink. It was there, among the brittle ledgers and municipal yearbooks, that he believed the trail would twist again, not through theft or forgery, but through something altogether more enduring. Land. Love joined him an hour later, cheeks ruddy and a bead of sweat tracing his temple despite the cool air. "I found it. Evidence log marked from 1962. Reopened during a probate dispute, then closed again under instruction from Chief Constable Glaister. You think it ties in?" "Everything ties in," Purbright replied without looking up. "It's simply a matter of which threads were intentionally cut." He turned a dusty page and pointed to an entry from July 1949. "Copeland, F.W., transaction involving Homewood Farm and adjacent woodland, transferred to a shell trust based in County Down. Trustees unlisted. Deed incomplete." Love frowned. "Homewood Farm? That's out near Bellringer's Hollow?" And in 1953 it was requisitioned by the Ministry of Agriculture and later resold to a development firm whose shareholders included, according to this annotation, 1A Reeve. The solicitor? His father. But the firm hasn't changed hands since. It remains a family concern, now leased to tenants, all perfectly legal, until one asks how it was acquired in the first place. "You think Copeland hid evidence of this inside the Barwise?" "Not evidence. Memory. The clock, Sergeant, was not merely a timepiece. It was a private vault." Love stared at the old ledger, absorbing the implications. "Still," he said slowly, "we've no proof those documents survived, let alone that someone's using them." Purbright closed the book. Then let's find someone who might know, someone who remembers Copeland's habits better than the rest. That afternoon, they paid a quiet visit to Miss Frances Daly, the former secretary to the late Mr. Copeland. Her cottage, framed by a battered lilac bush and 2 stone squirrels, was immaculately tidy, and she received them in a crisp blouse and skirt that looked freshly ironed for the occasion. "I've been expecting someone," she said matter-of-factly as they entered. "Ever since I saw the news about the clock. Silly, isn't it, to expect burglars in Flaxborough?" "We aren't burglars, Miss Daly," said Purbright. "Just investigators trying to untangle an old story with too many blank pages." She pursed her lips. "He kept it all, you know. Frederick, every letter, every agreement. He was terrified that history would forget him, or worse, rewrite him." "Did he mention the clock?" "He used to joke that if the vicar ever knew what was ticking inside it, he'd excommunicate the furniture." Love coughed gently. "What exactly was inside?" Daly hesitated, eyes flicking between them. "I never saw the full contents, but there were files. One thick envelope marked H-confidential and a roll of maps, I think. He locked them behind the pendulum, said it was safer than any solicitor's vault, especially his own solicitor." "Reeve?" Purbright asked. "Mr. Copeland didn't trust him? Not after 1978? "Why not?" "Something to do with signatures. There was a property agreement. 2 names, 1 pen. He never said more than that." "And you're certain the documents were never moved?" "Quite certain. He showed them to me once when he feared he might not last the winter. Then he changed his mind and said the world wasn't ready for the truth." Outside, the drizzle had returned, as though the weather had grown bashful about its earlier optimism. Purbright stood beneath the porch, watching droplets gather along the gutter's edge. "If Reeve feared exposure," he said to Love, "he wouldn't take the papers to destroy them. He'd keep them, use them perhaps, or offer them back, for a price." Love glanced back at the cottage. "Then we need to search his office." "Too obvious. He knows we're watching." "No, we go elsewhere, to where ghosts don't know they've been buried." He didn't elaborate, but instead directed Love to arrange a quiet meeting with Veronica Loring. They found her at her cottage that evening, surrounded once more by the paraphernalia of eclectic memory and domestic disorder. "You again," she said, ushering them in. "Have we moved on from clocks to hauntings?" "We'd like to ask a favor," Purbright said, "strictly off the record." Her eyebrows lifted. "Do you still have your key to the old vestry loft?" "I do." "Then I need you to take us there. Quietly. Tonight." At just past 8, with the town beginning to draw curtains against the rain, the 3 of them entered St. Ethelwald's through the side door. The nave was empty, save for the lingering echo of a choir rehearsal long dispersed. Loring led them up a narrow staircase, hidden behind the organ's paneling. At the top was a locked wooden door, which she opened with a key that had long since lost its label. Inside, the loft was dusty, cramped, and packed with boxes bearing yellowing labels. Missions 1947, Bell Roster 1961, Ladies' Guild Minutes, unexpurgated. It was not the kind of place one stumbled across, nor the kind one visited unless one had reason. Purbright moved to a battered steel cabinet in the corner and pulled the handle. It stuck, then groaned open. Within, among old pamphlets and forgotten hymnals, was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, bound with twine and marked barwise, private. He opened it. Inside, folded with the care of a man who feared both moths and betrayal, were 3 documents: a land deed from 1949, a letter addressed to "my executor," and a signed affidavit from one Basil Trenwith, a former notary, attesting that the land known as Homewood Farm had been improperly claimed through forged declarations. Love let out a low breath. "We've got him." "Not yet," Purbright said, though he tucked the envelope safely into his coat. But now we know what the thief was looking for and what someone else failed to find." "Then who has the clock?" Loring asked. Purbright's voice was almost a whisper. "Someone who wanted the contents, but not the truth." The air inside the vestry loft remained still, but not stagnant, more like a hush of breath held between generations. The three of them stood in silence for a few moments after the box had been opened, the weight of the documents inside far greater than their paper mass. Inspector Purbright did not speak immediately. Instead, he gently refolded the deed, the affidavit, and the letter, treating each not as evidence, but as remnants of a mind trying, in its final days, to preserve something no one else would defend. Then he looked to Veronica Loring. "You never saw these?" "I assumed," she said quietly, "but I never knew." Purbright nodded. "And now you must choose whether to forget again." She said nothing, but her eyes said quite enough. She would remember. Perhaps, if asked at the right moment, she might remember aloud. Back at the station, Love made 3 photocopies of the documents, sliding each one into its own labeled envelope before placing the originals in the station safe. They'd be logged officially by morning, but tonight required something subtler than procedure. As the rain lightened to a misty drizzle, Purbright walked the half-mile to Copeland House, alone. Honoria greeted him in the front hall, still dressed in slate grey but without the crimson brooch this time. She looked more tired than he had seen her, and somehow younger for it. "You found them," she said before he had even spoken. He didn't confirm it aloud. Instead, he offered her one of the envelopes. "I believe your uncle left these not only for his executor, but for a witness. Someone who could say, later, he did try to tell the truth." She took the envelope with trembling fingers, opened it carefully, and read. Her lips compressed. The letter, written in her uncle's meticulous hand, was brief. "To Honoria, if this reaches you, I am dead, and someone is hiding what you now hold. The land was taken wrongly. I signed things I should not have. I let others use my name and did not question why. The clock became my conscience. Do what is just, not what is easy. FWC." She set it down. "Does Reeve know this exists?" "No," Purbright said. "But he suspects. And suspicion is often more dangerous than knowledge. He'll come for it." "Yes. And if I refuse?" "Then he will try another way." She looked at him, then folded the letter and placed it in a kitchen drawer with slow, precise movements. "I was raised to protect a family name, but the truth is, our name protected no one." The kettle began to whistle softly behind her. She didn't move to silence it. "I'll speak publicly, if needed," she said. "I'll call the development firm and the papers, and the vicar, if it helps." Purbright's expression remained unreadable. "It may." She poured tea into a thick white cup and offered it without flourish. He took it and drank. Later, back at the station, he found Love still at his desk, going over the auction guest list once more with a furrowed brow. "Sir," he said as Purbright sat down, "I think we missed something." "How so?" "This name here, T. Ellison. Signed in the same hand as the line above it. Not the same person, I think." Purbright leaned in. "A duplicate entry?" "Possibly. Or someone trying to blend into the crowd by adding a fake name. And if I cross-reference the addresses?" He slid a file across. "Only one of these names matches a verifiable property, the others fabricated or untraceable, which suggests planning." "And intention," Love said. "Someone came to that auction not to buy or bid, but to watch, to time, and to move, and I think they came in a van." Purbright's eyes lifted slightly. "Go on." "The alley behind the hall, it has tire impressions, tracked through wet earth, deep and recent. I took a casting earlier today, and I asked Constable Renwick to walk the nearby streets this evening. One van, parked 2 blocks away on Brindle's Row, matches the tread." Purbright stood. "Take me to it." It was after midnight when they reached the alley. The van, a plain grey vehicle with no markings, sat dark beneath a flickering street lamp. Purbright circled it, observing the rear latch, the dried traces of wood dust near the door hinges, the faintest fingerprint smudge on the rear window. Love gestured toward the curb. "It was reported parked here yesterday morning, unattended, no license on file with the auctioneers, and yet no ticket, no complaint." "Because someone paid to keep it overlooked," Purbright said, "and not in cash." The constable who joined them from the night shift handed over a slim envelope found under the driver's seat. It contained one thing, a folded newspaper clipping from 1962. A story about the Homewood land dispute, the sudden reversal of a ministry claim, and the new development contract signed a week later by none other than a young solicitor named Martin Reeve. A handwritten note was scrawled in the margin. He learned from the best. Purbright read it once, then handed it to Love. "We've been watching the wrong Reeve, sir. We assumed Aubrey was hiding his father's crime. But what if he's not hiding it? What if he's repeating it? Better yet, refining it?" Love looked stunned. "Then he's more than just a solicitor. He's a historian with an eraser." "Exactly. And the clock was never just about guilt. It was a key, a timeline, a warning." The inspector stepped back and surveyed the van one final time before turning toward the mist-shrouded streets. Someone staged a theft, but what they stole wasn't the clock. It was silent. Rain had returned in earnest by the time Inspector Purbright stood once more in the alley behind Thornsby Hall, his umbrella tilted against the wet gusts that clattered faintly along the rooftops. The van had been towed under warrant to the station's rear enclosure, but its lingering presence felt etched into the brick. Beside him, Sergeant Love scribbled notes while juggling a torch, a clipboard, and a rapidly dampening hat. "We've dusted the interior," Love reported, voice raised slightly over the rain. "No clear prints, wiped clean, but the interior lining has traces of brass polish and that same wood dust we found in Mrs. Prentice's shop." "So the bar-wise was in there," Purbright said quietly. "Pieces of it, anyway. No doubt it was assembled elsewhere. Or not assembled at all." Love blinked. "You think they dismantled it permanently?" "I think they took what they needed," Purbright said, "and left the rest behind, either for sentiment or misdirection." The inspector turned and began walking slowly toward the corner of the alley, eyes sweeping the gutters, the doorways, the gaps in fencing. Rain distorted the familiar edges of the buildings, made the world seem slightly unmade, like a stage between acts. But there, just beyond the drain pipe, was something that didn't belong. A length of green wool. He crouched and plucked it from the bricks, a torn tassel from a hat, soaked now and trailing threads. "Green hat," he said. "Loring mentioned one. And Ambler saw it." Love leaned in. "Think it belonged to the same woman? Or was warned to suggest she was present?" He turned the piece over in his gloved hand. "It was left here deliberately. Caught just so. A reminder or a plant?" Love frowned. "So now we've got a solicitor, a collector, a missing clock, a forged name, a parked van, and a green hat playing dress-up. We still don't know who physically took the thing." Purbright stood, eyes fixed on the narrow service door at the side of the hall. "Perhaps it's time we ask someone who saw what none of us did." The hall caretaker, Mr. Cyril Skeggs, was summoned from his nearby flat, visibly irked at the interruption, but mollified by the promise of hot tea and a biscuit. He was a man of uncertain age and infinite suspicion, who cleaned as though preparing for judgment and knew every creak and panel of the building back corridor, he said when asked. "Yes, unlocked during the event, but only for portering. I keep the main doors watched, but that one's, well, it's discreet. Too discreet, if you ask me." Purbright nodded. "Any of the staff used it that morning?" "Just young Henley, one of the lot assistants. Slipped out around 11, said he'd dropped his glasses. Back in 10 minutes, didn't think much of it. Did he seem flustered? No more than usual. He's always pink about something. Would you recognize him if he wasn't Henley? Skeggs blinked. What? I mean, if someone were impersonating him. Could it be done? Well, he's not got the most distinctive walk, if that's what you mean. Bit of a stoop, wears a cap low. But I'd notice if someone completely different tried it. Purbright paused. Unless they didn't. The inspector turned to Love. Track Henley down. Tonight. Quietly. Love was off with a nod, already dialing the on-call rotor. Purbright lingered in the doorway, glancing back into the dim hallway beyond the service entrance. There, glinting faintly on the floor, was something else. A smudge of brass, barely visible on the flagstone. He stooped and pressed a handkerchief to it, lifting a faint, curved impression. The missing escutcheon plate had a twin, he murmured, and this one came off here. Back at the station, Henley was found, or rather, not found. He wasn't home. His landlady hadn't seen him since midday the day before. His bicycle was still chained behind the hall, untouched, and his phone rang unanswered. Love returned with the update, expression tight. We've got a trace on his bank card, used last night just before 8 at the petrol station on the A47. That's 20 miles from here. Too far for a man without transport. Purbright turned to the wall map behind his desk and traced a line from the auction hall to the A47. It curved neatly past Copeland House, past the solicitor's office, past the estate office where Homewood's current leases were held. He didn't go missing, Purbright said. He was moved. Love's brow creased. By who? A man with a vested interest in making the theft look like a vanishing act. Someone who could walk through an auction room unnoticed, then step back into his office before tea. Reeve. Yes. Or someone in his employ. Someone with gloves and a green hat and just enough confidence to push a pram or trolley down a back corridor. Love was silent for a beat. So what now? Purbright looked at the envelopes in his drawer, the affidavit, the deed, the letter. Then he picked up the envelope left at Honoria's door. Now, he said, we make it public. The contents, the confession, the false legacy. We tip our hand. We show it was never a game of cards, only a clock, and a secret it could no longer hold. The press release was drafted by midnight. A copy of the affidavit would be hand-delivered to the county archivist, another place with the diocese, under seal. The last, as insurance, was sent anonymously to the editor of the Flaxborough Gazette with a covering note signed by a made-up name. By dawn, the truth would no longer belong to anyone. As the clock in the station's hallway struck 3, an ordinary, unremarkable chime, Purbright stood slowly and reached for his coat. Love looked up. Going somewhere, sir? The inspector's face was unreadable. Back to the Copeland property, the garden shed in particular. Mr. Copeland once said a clock ticked even when it had no hands. Sir, he meant guilt, and I think we're about to find what someone tried so very hard not to hear. Inspector Purbright had seen many sheds in his career. Garden sheds, tool sheds, converted outhouses that masqueraded as workshops. But none had felt quite so self-conscious as the one tucked behind the Copeland property. It sat under a shroud of ivy, thick enough to muffle footsteps, its roof sagging slightly as though straining to keep the weight of secrets held within. The only light came from the inspector's hand torch, a weak beam playing over warped wooden panels and a rusted bolt on the door, which stuck on the first tug and groaned open with theatrical reluctance on the second. Inside, the smell hit first. Linseed oil, dry timber, and the faintest echo of old tobacco. Someone, perhaps Copeland himself, had once used this space regularly, but not for gardening. The benches were too clean. The floor bore no trace of earth. Everything had a strange, methodical order to it. Chisels lined up with geometric perfection, brushes dry but not dust-covered, as if they'd been used not long ago. Purbright stepped in fully and turned in a slow circle. At the back, beneath a paint-streaked sheet, sat what could only be described as the ghost of the barwise. The tall case stood half-assembled, its upper section tilted slightly, exposing the hollow behind where the pendulum would have swung. The front panel, glass removed, hung ajar, and the brass fittings had been detached and left on a small cloth nearby. It wasn't just disassembled, it was being reconstituted, or perhaps replaced. He leaned closer and ran his fingers over the edge of the interior cavity. The faint outline of a rectangle still marked where the hidden box had once been secured, the screws long gone. Nearby, a small packet of polishing cloths and a canister of varnish waited, unopened. Someone was planning to return it, he murmured. A sound behind him, a branch snapping, made him step back and switch off the torch. Another footfall, closer this time. Light, but not cautious. He waited. The shed door creaked again, and a figure appeared in silhouette. Tall, male, gloved. Purbright spoke before the man could reach for the light switch. "Good evening, Mr. Reeve." A pause. "You always did enjoy dramatic entrances, Inspector," said Reeve, his voice smooth and barely strained. "Though I confess I wasn't expecting a midnight inventory check." Purbright turned the torch on again, but kept it low, angled toward the half-completed case. "It seems you've acquired quite the skill in restoration." "I had help," Reeve said calmly, stepping inside and shutting the door behind him. "You met Lavinia Prentice, I assume?" She wasn't aware she was assisting in a crime. He smiled faintly. "Who mentioned crime?" Purbright gestured at the hollow clock. "This is concealment of evidence, theft of private property, obstruction of justice. Would you like me to continue?" "There's no evidence here, Inspector. Not anymore. Whatever was in that clock has long since ceased to exist." "Then why rebuild it?" Reeve said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Because it's the only way to erase what it once contained." Purbright moved closer. "Your father signed the homeward deed." "Yes. And you've been living under the weight of it ever since." "Number, I've been living with the consequences of other men's decisions. I merely manage them." "By stealing a clock?" Reeve laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You really believe this is about timekeeping?" "I believe it's about power. And fear." Reeve walked past the inspector and ran his hand down the side of the clock case with a reverence that was almost unsettling. "Do you know what this was to my father? A vault, but to me it was a monument, and monuments fall." Purbright said nothing. "The truth is," Reeve continued, "he wasn't clever. Just cautious. He kept those documents because he feared exposure. I removed them because I understood leverage. So the van, the false names, Henley's disappearance, your work?" Reeve looked almost amused. "Number, not directly. But it's remarkable what people are willing to do when they believe you might ruin them. Henley was paid to walk out the back and hand over the clock to someone else. He's in Nottingham now, very well compensated. And the letters Copeland left? Ah, yes, that was his final mistake, thinking sentiment was stronger than silence." Purbright stepped back toward the door. "You've just admitted to orchestrating theft and coercion." "I've admitted to nothing," Reeve said, "and unless you have a recording device tucked in your shoe, Inspector, I doubt you'll find a confession in thin air." Purbright nodded once, as if conceding the point. Then he pulled from his coat pocket the brass escutcheon, the second one, lifted from the alley floor, and placed it gently on the workbench. Reeve stared at it. "You missed a detail," Purbright said softly. "This doesn't match the new fittings." Reeve's composure flickered. Barely, but it was enough. I think you meant to recreate the bar-wise exactly. So that when it returned to the auction floor months from now, relisted in another estate, no one would remember what it once held. Just a refurbished relic. But this, he tapped the brass plate, this tells a different story. One of replication. Fraud, not recovery. Reeves' jaw tightened. You won't prove that. Number. But the people of Flaxborough don't need proof. Just a story. And you've given them one. As Purbright reached for the door, Reeves said, If you release the contents, I'll sue for defamation. You're welcome to, Purbright said without turning. Though I suspect a man who hides in garden sheds at 2 a.m. would prefer a quieter settlement. Outside, the inspector rejoined Love near the garden gate. The sergeant's breath clouded in the air as he took in the inspector's expression. Well? He asked. He blinked, Purbright replied. Love gave a grim nod. You think he'll run? Number, he's too proud, but he'll try to reframe it all before the papers hit circulation. Shall I inform the Gazette? Yes, and ask them to print the letter first. Copeland's confession, in full, before the land deeds. Let the readers decide who the real clockmaker was. Love tilted his head. And the clock? Purbright looked back once toward the ivy-covered shed where old Wood and older Lies sat waiting for their next appointment. Let it stay in pieces, he said. More answers in next chapter. But before the clock strikes final judgment, what do you believe should be preserved? Legacy or truth? The morning Flaxborough Gazette hit the newsstands with the kind of quiet ferocity that only local papers could manage. There were no exclamation marks, no sensational layout, just a 2-column story near the fold under the headline, Estate Clocks, Secrets Reveal, Legacy of Deceit. What followed was a full transcript of Frederick Copeland's letter, accompanied by a facsimile of the affidavit signed by Basil Trenwith. There was no editorial slant, no accusatory language, just facts laid bare, names on paper, and a series of transactions brought into the light after decades of burial. The article ended with a simple question posed to the reader. Who benefits when time forgets? By 10:30 that morning, the front desk at the Flaxborough police station had already fielded 6 calls, 2 from concerned parishioners asking whether the church would now reclaim Holmwood as sacred land, 1 from a solicitor in Sudcaster, querying the implications for historic land registry precedent, and 3 anonymous suggestions that someone should look into whether Reeves' father was ever properly licensed. At 11:15, Aubrey Reeve arrived. He wore a grey 3-piece suit, darker than the one from their earlier meeting, and his expression was the calm veneer of a man trying to read a storm through a closed window. Purbright was already waiting in the incident room, where the brass escutcheon plate sat on the desk like punctuation to a statement no longer needing to be made. I've come to make a statement, Reeve said evenly as he stepped inside. Purbright inclined his head. About the Barwise? About the matter of historical documents, those alleged to have been stored in the timepiece. I intend to clarify my position. You're welcome to, Purbright said, though I should warn you, Mr. Reeve, the matter may soon be beyond the scope of clarification. The Diocesan Heritage Council has opened an inquiry, and the Ministry of Land Records has requested access to the Holmwood transfer files. Reeve's jaw tightened slightly. The property was acquired in good faith. Perhaps, but it was enabled in bad. The solicitor folded his coat over the back of a chair, but did not sit. I knew, he said, from the moment my father involved himself in the Holmwood affair, that it would outlive him. What I didn't expect was that someone would choose a grandfather clock to tell the tale. He didn't trust anyone else, Purbright replied. No, Reeve agreed. And perhaps he was right. Love entered quietly, holding a small folder. Background check on the Henley lad, he murmured. Turns out he's a cousin of Reeves' junior clerk, paid off in installments, currently staying at a boarding house in Loughborough. Purbright nodded once. Thank you, Sergeant. Reeve said nothing. His eyes, however, gave a flicker of exasperated defeat. "So," Purbright continued, "we have a dismantled clock, a vanished assistant, a forged guest entry, a stolen van, and an attempted reconstruction of history." "It wasn't theft," Reeve said almost softly. "It was containment. Semantics, Mr. Reeve. Courts are rarely kind to semantics when paired with forgery and coercion." There was a long pause. Reeve's shoulders finally sagged. "What happens now? You'll be formally questioned. Charges may follow, but more importantly, the truth will prevail. You've attempted to control a narrative. Instead, you've ensured its distribution." "And Copeland?" Reeve asked. "Does he escape with noble last words?" Purbright gave the faintest shrug. He confessed. He made no attempt to excuse. That puts him at least in the realm of the human. Reeve's laugh was bitter. "I suppose that's all any of us can ask." He left under escort, without handcuffs, but without pretense either. Later that afternoon, the church bell rang unexpectedly. One long, resonant toll that drifted across the rooftops like an elegy for something unnamed. Sergeant Love looked up from his desk and said, "That'll be the vicar," his way of commenting. Purbright stood by the window, or perhaps Copeland's clock chiming at last. By 4, Honoria Copeland arrived, carrying a box under one arm. She looked calmer than she had in days, and her voice was steady. "I've decided not to restore the clock," she said. "The frame will be donated to the parish hall, just as Uncle once intended, but it won't keep time. It will stand silent." Purbright turned to her. "That seems appropriate." She placed the box gently on his desk. "And this is for you." Inside were the final contents of the clock's cavity. A faded photograph of a younger Frederick Copeland with 2 men, one of them unmistakably Martin Reeve, standing in front of the Homewood estate gate. Behind them, just visible in the background, was a cart with barrels marked "Ministry Clearance." Another era, another deal. "No one else knew this existed," she said. "I thought perhaps it belonged in your case file, or a museum." "We'll preserve it," Purbright said. As dusk settled, the inspector took one final walk around the perimeter of Thornsby Hall. The auction had ended days ago, yet the air still held echoes, the rustle of catalogues, the soft tension of bidding wars, the eruption of scandal. He paused near the anteroom door where the pram had first vanished, its wheels now ghost-traced on the floor of memory. Sergeant Love joined him, hands deep in his coat pockets. "Funny, isn't it?" "What is?" "A story about a clock turns out to be a story about guilt, about land, about inheritance. People keep time differently, I suppose." Purbright smiled faintly. "Some tick, some talk." They stood in companionable silence as the church bell struck 6. And somewhere across town, in a shed still muffled with ivy, the disassembled bar-wise remained, as quiet as memory and as heavy as regret.